and its cultural makeup, and most of the leaders of the opposition in 2004, when they commented on the Greater Middle East and the Broader Middle East initiatives, tended to reject them and to draw some similarities between these initiatives and the new Middle East initiative proposed by Shimon Peres in the mid-90s, for example, or even earlier attempts at Western hegemony in the region. And this was actually more or less across the board. You found that the WAF party leader at the time, Ahram, comparison between the Greater Middle East Initiative and the Baghdad Pact earlier in the 20th century. Similarly with the Nasserist and leftist opposition, both of them argued that the Greater Middle East Initiative is simply a second version of the new Middle East Initiative proposed by Shimon Peres. The Muslim Brotherhood maintained that this was an attempt to dilute Egypt's Arab and Islamic identity. So all the public statements made by the leaders of the opposition in response to American reform initiatives tended to reject them. However, I think in reality the response was more nuanced or complicated than that. I think external reform initiatives, specifically American reform initiatives, provoked the leaders of the opposition to issue their own domestic or internal reform initiatives as a response, and also because I think they found that this was an opportune moment to push for the demands that they have had for many decades now. So even though they tended to reject these initiatives, they nonetheless realized that they created an opportunity for them to mobilize. And this was the case for the Muslim Brotherhood and also for the Kifaya movement, which emerged shortly after the US began to take up the question of democratization in Egypt and the region. And you find that some of these movements, even though they rejected these initiatives, tended to moderate their discourse towards the American administration. So for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, when it issued its reform initiative in 2004, it didn't say anything about the United States and Israel in that document, which was surprising to many, given that the Muslim Brotherhood tended to use the question of imperialism and the Arab-Israeli conflict on a regular basis in most of its literature. So they shied away from addressing that topic, realizing that this was a historical moment that they could use to their advantage. Similarly, the leaders of Kifaya, which came from different ideological orientations, agreed to focus specifically on the question of democracy, which they all agreed on, and to focus less on the question of Israel and foreign hegemony and so forth, which was divisive and also which could alienate the external support that they were getting at that moment. So I think there were two sides to the response. I think rhetorically there was rejection, but in reality the leaders of the opposition used that moment to press for their demands. I think the exception to this were the formal political parties who tended to shy away from mobilizing against the regime during that particular moment, fearing that the new movements or the Brotherhood will gain the advantage should they also mobilize. So this is with regards to the broader strategies proposed for the region during that time, specifically 2004-2005. On another level, the discourse of the opposition regarding US aid to Egypt in general since 1975 until the present has tended to be critical. And it's part of the repertoire of criticisms that the opposition has used against the Egyptian regime. The fact that it has heavily depended on American and Western aid, that this is an instrument to perpetuate hegemony and dependency and so forth. So you find that in the discourse of the opposition, I think whether it's a nationalist or a liberal or Islamist or leftist, in many instances the US aid issue comes up as a means of criticizing the Egyptian regime. However, different forces in the opposition tend to focus on different areas. So for example, you find that the Islamists tend to focus on the question of education. And recently they've launched an attack against many of the USAID programs that target education in Egypt, and they see this as a way of trying to dilute Egypt's Islamic and Arab identity. So this is for them one of the key issues, that the USAID, by involving itself in education reform, is westernizing Egyptian culture and stripping it to its authenticity. Leftists, on the other hand, tend to focus on the economic reforms and how they've created a new business class in Egypt whose interests are aligned with the United States and even Israel in some of the discourse you find mentioned about the Quiz Treaty and so forth. So the focus of many of the leftists in the opposition when it comes to discussing USAID is the question of the ruling coalition and the control exercised by the business class over wealth and power in Egypt, and they see this as a direct product of the privatization and trade liberalization programs that were encouraged by USAID in Egypt for the past decades. Nasrists, on the other hand, tend to focus on the question of the peace treaty with Israel, and they see USAID as a way of making Egypt stick to a particular foreign policy agenda that is dictated by the US, and they argue that this has undermined Egypt's standing in the Arab world and the Muslim world, and undermined its sovereignty and so forth. So for them, the peace treaty and Egypt's Arab and regional standing tend to be the issue they bring up the most when they criticize the relationship between the Egyptian and the American governments, and specifically the question of aid. Liberals tend to focus more on the question of dependency and national unity. But for them, they use the question of aid. The Waqf Party uses the question of USAID less frequently than the others. But they also have used it to criticize the Egyptian government. So this is with regards to the broad initiatives and USAID to Egypt in general. I think when you get to the programmatic dimension of USAID, you find a very different reaction. I think activists in the Egyptian opposition across the board are willing to work with USAID or its contractors on very specific programs such as election monitoring or media monitoring or study tours or training programs when they are stripped of their, but they are not part of the larger plan. I think they seem more palatable to actors in the opposition. And I think the relationship between USAID and Egyptian activists has been most pronounced in the NGO sector and perhaps in the media, and less so in the political parties arena because of constraints imposed by the regime. So you find that in recent years, USAID and MEPI have both worked with Egyptian NGOs on very ambitious election and media monitoring programs, and there seemed to be willingness on the part of the NGO sector to work with USAID on these kinds of issues, and less resistance than what we see with regards to the grand strategies. However, there are also divisions within the NGO sector about the question of American and Western aid in general. So, for example, in the 2005 parliamentary elections, there were 3 different coalitions that monitored, coalitions of NGOs that monitored the elections. And one of the reasons why they didn't all unite into one coalition was the question of aid, because some of the groups that engaged in election monitoring did not want to receive aid from MEPI or American organizations to conduct election monitoring. So it's still a divisive issue, but I think for the most part NGOs have less scruples about working with USAID on specific projects, especially when the money comes through contracting agencies rather than directly from USAID, which is often the case. I think cooperation between USAID and the political parties has been more complicated than that because the political parties law prohibits parties from receiving external funding, and also because the government has explicitly discouraged from that from happening. So, for example, when NDI and IRI, two American organizations that work specifically with political parties, tried to open offices in Egypt and to organize programs with political parties that were prevented from doing so by the Egyptian government. So there is a reluctance or a rejection by the Egyptian government to allow USAID to work directly with political parties. However, some younger activists from political parties have participated in training programs and study tours organized by USAID, I think more in their individual capacity. So, this is with regards to the opposition's response to the various American democracy promotion strategies. As for assessing the impact of USAID programs in Egypt on the process of democratization, I don't think this is an easy thing to measure, but I think no doubt some of the training programs and study tours and election monitoring programs and media monitoring programs and so forth have contributed to capacity building of activists in the Egyptian opposition, especially in the NGO sector.